Chris Nickel is a fourth-year PhD candidate in music at New York University. He is currently working on two projects. The first, his dissertation, explores masculinity, mobility, and capital within the transnational underground music scenes centered on Beirut. The second takes up issues of gender, voices, and historiography, and the early operatic genre of the lament. Chris is also a shop steward, organizer, and activist with GSOC UWA, which is the Graduate Worker Union of NYU. And he's here today to present a paper called Queer Arab Musicking Men, Ethnography, and the Challenge of Queerness and Race. So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the conference organizers and also everybody who's speaking at this conference. I'm really, really honored to be able to be a part of these conversations. My paper title has changed slightly. I apologize for not clarifying that earlier. I'm going to be speaking today on queerness, normativity, and race in ethnography. So this paper emerges out of my discomfort in and anxiety over ethnographic encounters involving conversations about gender, sexuality, and race, when difference across those elements makes the conversation seem incoherent and thus problematic. What, if anything, do I as an ethnographer do about this discomfort and anxiety that arise during my fieldwork? How do my responses to these feelings shape the scholarship that comes out of these encounters? These feelings and the key questions they motivate frame this paper that focuses on relationships of race to queerness and normativity, a part of my larger dissertation project on youth's relations to movement, identity, and capital in Beirut's independent music scenes. Gathered from my latest of 3 preliminary fieldwork trips, the 2 interviews I'll discuss with an artist named Chino have helped me begin to formulate answers to these questions that will be fundamental to my ethnographic practice. My participation in a long tradition of white Orientalists traveling to the Middle East for research motivates sensitivity in my ethnography, even as the focus on performances of gender and sexuality emerges from a liberatory politics informed by my background as a formally educated queer cis man with rural US American roots coming from New York. Out of this tension, I seek to develop a relational ethnography, sensitive to both these liberatory politics and the risks of sexual colonialism that arise when we fail to consider gender and sexuality in the context of race and empire. The stakes of these questions feels very high. My colleagues' prescient comments on earlier drafts of this paper helped me realize that the same failures of the liberatory politics to provide an easy answer to my dilemmas here are the same ones that make it hard for me, with roots in rural West Virginia, to take a stand on the issue of deplorables of the white working class. It's this impossible choice between condemnation and relativism that I foreground. After considering my discomforts during my first interview with Chino, I quote at length from our second interview as we worked through mutual anxieties. I conclude by suggesting that ethnography, not oriented toward producing knowledge per se, but rather toward being in the world together, one in which we can talk about how we talk, can help us sort out these relationships between race, queerness, and normativity. Throughout, I include Chino's voice as much as possible, because it's the closest I can offer you to his thoughts and feelings. I include my voice when relevant, but I gloss my own thoughts and feelings when possible because I'm in the flesh to explain myself. This decision is fraught, and I'm happy to discuss it further with you in the Q&A. Nasser Shorbaji, better known by his stage name Chino, is a Beirut-based rapper working both as an English-language solo artist and with Arabic hip-hop collective Fari Al-Atrash, the Deaf Group, the first to popularize hip-hop in Lebanese dialect in the early aughts. Chino has struggled with finding a home. As someone of Syrian and Filipino backgrounds, both of which are the objects of racism, prejudice, and working class associations in Lebanon, he grew up a middle-class migrant kid in English-speaking schools in Saudi Arabia and the Philippines. This struggle directly motivates the title of his June 2015 debut album, Making Music to Feel at Home. The question of origins and race is one that Chino has told me he aims to tackle in his music. But because he has done so many journalistic interviews on race and its role in his music, I opted not to ask about the topic during our first interview. I had found with other artists that topics that have received lots of press coverage don't often make for good ethnographic interview material, at least not initially. Nevertheless, our interactions, like many in my ethnography, are mediated by racialized difference, channeled in this case through his talk of the West versus the Middle East, my talk about colonialism, and our visible phenotypic differences. In our first interview together at a coffee shop near where we both live, and joined by his friend Marwan, Chino said some things that didn't sit well. He repeatedly addressed topics of gender, including women and trans folk, the first several times with no prompting from me. At one point, he volunteered an experience with all-gender bathrooms at a festival in Germany as something that made him think, but it's not clear exactly what. This quotation illustrates the discomfort that I felt.
The debate is ongoing, you know, so it made me like, oh, this is happening. Yeah, that's kind of cool, you know. I'm from the Philippines, so there's a big transgender, transsexual community over there, you know, so to see, I think, the Western community being open like that and being, you know, cross-dressing and whatnot, you know, and it took me a while to be like, hey, this is happening, you know, because I just don't see it here, you know. But from Philippines, there's a big transgender, transsexual community, you know, and then I saw it in that festival, and it was just quite normal. You know, it's really weird, man. Like, that whole time I was there for 3 days, and it's quite crazy, and people, and it didn't seem very sexual at all, you know. I didn't get that vibe.
Chino's Filipino roots give him a familiarity with ways of being trans that don't necessarily line up with my experiences, but the connection between that familiarity and his encounter with Western cross-dressing and whatnot doesn't emerge clearly from the interview. It does seem like he's reaching to triangulate the easily racialized differences among the Philippines over there, the Middle East here, and Germany in the West. But only at the end does it become clear that he may also be trying to parse why the gender non-normativity of these trans people may not have been associated with sex work or uncontrollable public displays of sexuality. I felt uneasy, defensive of the gender non-conforming people in my life who have widely varying sexualities, even as I gave my standard ethnographic, oh, that makes sense. Later on, when I asked him about his thoughts on the relation of gender and music, his critique of the presumed male-dominated scene of early hip-hop that resulted in revealing female album covers and overtly sexual lyrics left no room for black female artists who may choose to perform that way. During this discussion of hip-hop and gender, he also made a point that I heard to normalize homophobia in hip-hop, saying,
It's all right to be gay in other genres than hip-hop.
yeah.
Yeah, it's still tough for you to be gay and do raps, man.
Yeah.
You're not gonna get accepted the same way, man.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
You can be accepted by, you know, the gay community. You know, oh, he's a good rapper, let's push him, you know?
Yeah.
But you're not, but from hip-hop, it's still gonna take mad time, man. Yeah. Like my friend Ocean, he's not really hip-hop, but he grew up, he came out like
As bi, not even as gay.
yeah, and then, you know, so, and he's not real hip-hop either, you know, he's not rapping, you know, he's still doing R&B music, which is very introverted, and, you know, so, yeah, I think that's more acceptable, you know.
I felt an even deeper sense of discomfort at these comparatively minor remarks because Chino seemed to think he was on the right side of things, but said things that felt dissonant with that avowed self-perception. It's similar to how I feel discussing these issues with my well-meaning liberal family. I felt like I should have spoken up, outed myself, engaged him more on these points, but I had not been prepared to do any of those things in the moment during an interview ostensibly focused on music, politics, and protest in Beirut. Further, the specter of colonialism, made so palpable by phenotypic differences between us, had already powerfully racialized his talk of West and Rest when discussing artists' opportunities for success in what he considered to be the culturally retrograde Middle East. To have said anything felt like it would have been flirting dangerously with the sexual imperialism that I find so fraught in other ethnography of gender and sexuality in the region. As I produced the first draft of this paper in early September, I wrestled with writing, feeling pinned between the poles of cultural relativism and sexual imperialism in my responses to Chino's talk. A couple of weeks later, a few days before I left for New York, I texted him to see if he would be down for a second interview. He agreed, and I nervously wrote out some thoughts before we met at another coffee shop in the same neighborhood. Turns out we were both a bit nervous, tentatively bringing our own fragilities to the table at first until the conversation began flowing more freely. I came away with a better understanding of Chino's good intentions during our first interview. He made clear that his digressions were fraught workings out of topics he knew were in the air globally, and which he knew he needed to show he understood as a self-professed liberal progressive, but which he did not feel he understood. I think he came away with a better understanding of my position as well. Near the end of our conversation, he candidly and sensitively asked me if I could talk about my desires and how I fit into my own conceptions of queerness. I answered him frankly and tried to give him a better sense of how race and non-normativity can be variously configured from my own monogamous relationship with a heterosexual brown cis woman. We also began to clarify the stakes of our investments in activist work to each other. Early on, when Chino said it's important for queer folk to explain themselves so others can be more accepting, I made my commitments clear by fronting the invisibility of transphobic violence in Beirut, arguing that the burden is on queer activists and their allies. Chino pointed up his commitment to anti-racist work that linked up with activists he had met at the festival he mentioned in Berlin.
Yeah, I have my own fight of, like right now, conversations that's very important to me, is racism in this part of the world. It's immigration. It's immigration, so these are like people just I see much more of it, right now because it's right in front of me, and then I know a lot of Syrians, I know a lot of mixed race, kids, so there is a similar fight, it is, it's a very, kind of, leftist kind of like, very progressive fight, and
He also spoke of his efforts through music and mentoring to mitigate the effects of Lebanese institutional and microsocial racism against visibly non-white minority teens whose migrant labor parents cannot get citizenship under Lebanese law. For all the mutual understanding, strains of the conversation held unresolved and potentially unresolvable anxieties and tensions. For analytic clarity, I organized these under three related and perhaps false binaries. First, are we racialized metonyms of the West and the rest, or are we individuals? Second, do we cleave to a liberatory politics or an ethical relativism? Third, do we analyze differences between cultural formations in terms of developmental progress narratives or not? We both oscillate between each term, never achieving mutual resolution. In the following two examples, Chino illustrates how some framings of our conversation prompted him to refer to the Western world at large as possessing knowledge he doesn't have, while other times he personalizes it, addressing me directly as a possessor of this knowledge.
And that's the thing, the Western world knows more about it than I do. It's just we haven't tackled these situations. I'm not saying they haven't existed. I'm just saying they're appearing more right now, and that's great,
Yeah.
And that will open the conversation. I don't know, you know more because you've read all about this. I'm really opening myself up to it because of course, it's concerned right now because a lot of more of my friends or people around me are being, are coming out, and I deal with them on a more regular basis, and I'm also more open to it. When I was younger, I just didn't care enough, maybe because, again, I knew less people that are.
I hear the second excerpt with a twinge of discomfort. Chino pins my knowledge on having read, which throws into relief how my positionality as an ethnographer is often overdetermined by my formal education that grants more authority than my experience as a queer person. Significantly, it is this formal education that conditions me to fall into the same metonymic binary, sometimes assessing Chino's speech as Chino, other times as his roles in my work, the Syrian in Lebanon, the Asian Arab, or the non-Black practitioner of Black expressive cultures. Chino also moves in and out of relativism depending on the context. When talking about terms, like the word liberal, he and I both agreed that different folks use words differently.
I'm not actually where these conversations are starting out from, you know. So how your conversation and which direction you're coming from, the definitions of those words differ from in context from where you're from. So I might be lost in translation, even though we're speaking the same language. But again, we're from different backgrounds, so I might use the word liberal a bit looser than than the actual definition of where you come from. You know,
and I may use words that are different than the ones that you are.
But things change when we discuss how I should handle these topics in interviews with people when it comes up, which happens often because gender and sexuality are a facet of my research informed by my own experiences in the world.
But there are people here who aren't that
so
way.
sensitive. Yeah, no.
And so, like, how do I, do I slam them in an interview and be like, no, that's homophobic, shut the fuck up?
I think you should.
Really?
I think you should. And I may not maybe homophobic, maybe be like, no, it's like, I don't get that. You know, like not slam them, but be like, just be firm about your belief. And I think you should be like, I don't understand how you feel that way, and why would you feel negative about that? Why does it affect you personally so much? You know, or something.
And can you explain where that comes from for you?
Yeah, you know, I think it's good to understand what they're trying to say, but you don't have to subscribe to their belief or accept it at all. You know, I think you can question it and leave it in the open-ended. This is their point of view, you know, and you're writing a paper. You know,
that makes sense.
But he's straight true to what you believe in, and let them know that. I believe that. You know.
Yeah.
Chino here suggests I confront people about perceived prejudices that don't line up with my liberatory politics, even as my conversation with him is struggling against overdetermination by my cultural capital and colonialist pedigree that open the doors to sexual imperialism. Our discussion of teleology gathers all three of the binaries I laid out. Chino asserts that the differences in understandings of gender and sexuality between the West and the Middle East are not teleological when he says, quote, "But it's true, man, it's not about being backwards, it's that we haven't been dealing with this," close quote. He goes on to suggest that these differences come from political circumstances, incurring some awkward moments of misunderstanding that never get resolution.
In general, I think there's also this important factor that we've had to deal with other levels of society, you know, and problems in society before we deal down with the sexuality, which is in your bedroom and seeping outwards, you know.
Yeah.
So we've still dealt with war, civil war 10 years ago. We're still, you know, so these are like little things, and now.
Not little.
Yeah, I mean, no, not little. Sorry, but like,
oh, you mean the other stuff? I mean, the Civil War is not little.
No, not little things, but like that's not little. But there's other things smaller, not little. You know, that's,
right.
You know, we're talking about survival.
Okay.
War.
Yeah.
You know, lack of resources, this and this and this, and on a bigger scale that governments have to really address. Now we're having this room to discuss the detailed and nuances of social assimilation and working out together, you know. Well, America itself hasn't been in war, you know, inside this country, you know, so you've had the stability of peace to have those conversations from the get-go, from, you know.
Right. It's a question of how much we've actually gotten out of that.
These differences may also be narrowing because of Western material intervention. Chino doesn't necessarily cast this in a negative light, but I raise some concerns that I uneasily slip into a pedagogical mode to explain.
That's fine, you know, that's your conversations, you know, so over here, we're coming out with it. I don't see it as we're late in this need, you know, like, it's just, we just have now the opportunity that people are coming out and talking about this. And not only that, I mean, to be honest, also there's the funding from the West to activate the funding of NGOs to activate the movement of the LGBT community.
Yeah.
So,
which is difficult. Like at that point, like there is a way, I think, in which there is a risk that. So remember we talked about intersectionality, right? And how like if we're going to consider class, we also have to consider race and gender and sexuality and all this stuff. So like there's a way that I think activism, particularly internationally through NGOs on LGBTQ issues, can actually work against other like progressive causes. So like what I'm thinking of is the idea that a lot of gay rights organizations are trying to legalize gay marriage.
Yeah.
That's their goal in the Middle East, for instance.
Yeah.
And it's like, that doesn't actually help solve the problem as much as it would if you decriminalize sexuality or you decriminalize gender nonconformity.
In response, Chino dwells on the possibility that sexuality was created and historically determined by the West, before offering it up as an unresolved debate.
We need to just accept, people's sexuality in the first place before we talk about gay marriage,
Yeah.
Like, how are we going to talk about, like, allowing this, sacred institution or whatever the fuck, to occur, and we're not even accepting gay people. So, and I think a big question is the Western society in the past 100 years, this is what shaped sexuality? Or
Yes.
or is that sexuality's normal evolution? I don't know, it depends, man. And in the Greek times, right? Greek sexuality was accepted, but it was viewed differently. So that's again how sexuality is shaped according to each one's culture. I think that's also a big debate.
And yet, even as he delves into these different possible explanations that don't explicitly rely on a teleological narrative of sexual awareness and rights in the Middle East, it inflects his language in ways that become points of discussion. And in the interest of time, I'll cut this last quotation, but he's referring to metaphors like being ahead of the curve or something being a big leap, both of which are spatial metaphors that reinforce a kind of teleological understanding of gender and sexuality. These tensions and anxieties may be fundamentally unresolvable. The kind of baggage we both have inherited in different ways from colonialism's insistence on developmental progress narratives will never go away because neo-colonial messaging from media, human rights activists, and politicians continues to do the work of maintaining these discourses in working order. But with further conversation over time, Chino and I may well be able to massage the tension of metonymically standing in for the cultural formations that have shaped us as we share and reaffirm each other's particularities. These particularities erode the workings of racialization and normativity in important interpersonal ways. Our swapping stories about being misracialized, I as Arab and he as non-Arab, acknowledges the arbitrariness of racial discourse alongside the power it still holds in the world. His offering up struggles with monogamy, after hearing about my non-normative sexuality, blurs the line between queer and normative. Chino and I have yet to come to an understanding of how race, channeled through empire and Western rest speak, and queerness, channeled through talk of masculinity, gay people, and trans folk, are articulated with one another. Although I share understandings with my radical queer friends in Beirut, Chino and I will inevitably come at it our own way, and that's important. I understand ethnography to be a tool not for knowledge per se, rather for being in the world together, for negotiating seemingly incommensurable difference through intentional listening and the development of a shared vocabulary for addressing that difference alongside sameness, representation, and power. This relational ethnography, then, seems to me to provide one way of getting at the entanglements of race, colonialism, normativity, and queerness that are in desperate need of understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thanks, Chris. It's a little bit unformed right now, but I am intrigued by your discussion of shared vocabulary at the end, and whether that is actually a good thing in trying to understand difference.
It's a really good question. I don't think its goodness is not innate. A shared vocabulary that is built would need to be built intentionally with these understandings of power dynamics and the legacies of empire and access to formal education. But I think if one is able to build the shared vocabulary around those elements, then I think it can actually be helpful in addressing difference. But I think it's sort of a live wire in that regard, because it could easily go quite wrong. If the shared vocabulary ends up coming from my academic toolkit, for instance, I think that would pose a lot of problems. So I think it's something that would need to be intentional, and I didn't actually think as much about it as I should have in the conclusion by referencing it, so I thank you for pointing it out. I think it has potential, but it's not innate potential, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to our next speaker. Oh, sorry. Sorry. No, I think we have 2. No, we might have a few minutes.
So the question or comment/question I have kind of connects to Eli's paper as well. I just wanted to point out, as I see this connection about silence and listening and speaking, silence isn't static, it isn't stable. Silence, it comes into being, into interactions, and depends on who's the one being silent, who's the one being silent, who's choosing to speak. And I think that's important in relation to your talk of unresolvable tensions with the person that you were speaking to in regard to, should I speak up and say something because this is against my politic? Because then you, as the researcher, can use silence in a number of different ways, either to your advantage to hide your politic, obviously, but I guess my real point is that when you use silence to not correct someone or not stand in, then not problem, but then I wonder, then what is the act, the end goal of that ethnographic practice in relation to knowledge? Because the idea, at least to my understanding, I could be wrong, you can correct me, is that we are these people that are bringing knowledge or information to this large pot of this field. And so how you're choosing to use silence, I think, does impact how you are creating knowledge, formulating knowledge. I'm just curious, how you see your role in that. I know it doesn't make any sense.
No, actually, it makes perfect sense. Thank you, Grace. I think that the choice of silence does directly impact the kind of knowledge that we produce, because if I'm silent in this kind of a conversation and don't follow it up with the kind of conversations that I'm trying to have ongoing with Chino, admittedly, they're quite thin right now at this point. If I don't follow it up or say something in the moment, the kind of knowledge that I'm going to be producing would logically tend toward trying to understand what I perceive as perhaps homophobic or transphobic language in the cultural scheme in which Chino exists, and bringing that to light. And that's a form of knowledge that I think is very common in anthropology and the social sciences, is this kind of what I sort of glossed as relativism, in that it doesn't bring to bear any overt judgments on what is said in ethnographic encounters. And I think the kind of knowledge that I say that I'm not interested in ethnography for generating knowledge per se. That per se is sort of, I'm using that to reference these normative modes of knowledge production about another person on which anthropology as a field has been based, basically. The idea that one field worker goes out into the field and sort of acquires and culls knowledge of kinship structures or exchange practices or what have you, and then brings that back to the academy. That's the kind of knowledge that I'm not so interested in producing, and of course that's kind of a pat critique at this point, but the kind of knowledge that I think does come up if we start to engage in dialogue, which of course always includes silences too, is this kind of intersubjective, possibly shared vocabulary, possibly mutual understanding, mapping of incommensurabilities, that kind of less concrete knowledge, perhaps. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think it's different kind of knowledge for sure that we're going for.